Hi there, United States History class. My name is Joel Jewin. I'm your instructor, and I'm going to kind of be giving these sort of weekly video reviews on a weekly basis. And this is going to kind of serve as my way of responding to your PowerPoint questions, as well as to the questions that are going to be posting for our document and primary source workshops. If you'll notice, I'm not going to be presenting a lot of direct feedback there, but I'll be providing kind of a review of the questions and sort of the answers that I was looking for, and at least my perspective on the questions within these documents themselves. Typically with the primary source questions, as long as you are trying to answer the question with the best information that you have available to you, you'll be getting points for the question. If perhaps, maybe you didn't quite explain your ideas enough and your answer doesn't quite answer the question, you might only get 1 point out of the two. And if for whatever reason your question just does not pertain, or your response does not pertain to the question, it's presenting false information, or if your answer does not meet the 35-word minimum requirement, you'll be getting 0 points out of the two. So that's kind of the grading scale I go on, and you can look at the rubric attached to the PowerPoints to get like a full dynamic of how that grading system works. If you do notice that for whatever reason you lost points on one of the PowerPoint assignments, you can go into the feedback for that question, and if I ever take off points, I will leave a notation for you to explain why that is. And if you want a further explanation, feel free to email me, and I can always get back to you and explain exactly where those points came from. But if you got full points, I'd certainly still recommend you watched these videos here, because I'm going to be filling in a lot of additional information, combining perhaps your answers with other perspectives from the class, and once more kind of giving my own take on them. So that's why these kind of weekly reviews are going to be pretty important for you to watch and to keep up on, because a lot of times you might answer a question, you might think you have some aspects of it right, but you might have a lot of questions still, and hopefully I'll be able to address a lot of those issues and a lot of those questions and concerns, and just provide more information in these little weekly videos we'll be sending out here. So let's get started with our first PowerPoint question here from the first week. Why might there have been more social equality in small groups of hunters and gatherers who were constantly moving than in later societies who lived in towns and cities? So very interesting question here, and a lot of you provided some very good answers to this question, really kind of focusing on the group dynamic, right? The fact that people would know each other more, so that there would be less inequality if you kind of had, if you knew who everyone was and you were all working with the same goal in mind, everyone had to work for survival. Those kind of answers were very, very good. Also, some people brought this aspect up too, and I think this is really important, that there's a couple of main things that you really need in order to have, or that we really see kind of lead to social stratification within later, much more kind of larger sedentary agricultural societies. And one of those factors is wealth, this idea of being able to accumulate a lot of something of value, whether that's surplus food, whether it's natural resources, whether it's other trade goods or trade items that people find valuable. And really, when you're talking about a small group of 30 to 50 people constantly on the move, you're pretty much restrained to your personal possessions, to whatever you can carry on your back, right? Everyone typically has about the same amount of resources. Maybe if you're really big and strong, you can carry a little bit more than someone else, but really nothing that can allow a group of this size to really kind of form an idea, a concept of wealth in a way that a large sedentary agricultural society that can have a lot of surplus can. And surplus is the key here, this idea of having enough resources in order to kind of create this idea of having more than someone else. So that's very important. Another aspect that feeds into this is there's really not a lot of occupational variation when you're talking about a hunting and gathering group. We'll talk about kind of the gender equality issue in just a moment here, but typically men did more hunting, women did more gathering, but still within those subsets, people were doing relatively the same amount of activity. So there wasn't really a big difference in occupation, jobs, and roles within these societies that people were filling. That certainly doesn't mean that there wasn't leaders or people who would, perhaps be, important and prominent and have prestige within their groups. There certainly were. The biggest difference you see between kind of these hunting and gathering groups and later societies is that this kind of prestige and what's the word I'm looking for here? authority, whatever you might have, really wasn't able to be passed on from generation to generation. Without the wealth to kind of back this system up, it really came down to more of a meritocracy, where people with, people who were better hunters, they might have a little bit more status than people who weren't, but who knows? A generation or two, that dynamic could completely switch within one group. So that this kind of long-term sustained separation between people did not occur in the same way in these small hunting-gathering groups than it does in later, larger societies. A lot of you also brought up this idea of differences in gender roles, and I think that plays a very important role too. Typically what we see is in societies where women promote more resources to the society or the family group, typically they have a much higher status within those societies. And societies in which women are expected to fulfill more domestic roles and not contribute to the public sphere, they typically have a much lower status. Within hunting and gathering groups, therefore, women, providing primarily gathering, not all the time. There were some women who engaged in some hunting activities as well, but primarily the gathering roles which women fulfilled, going out, finding plants, herbs, berries, just gathering all these various resources to help the group, brought in and typically brings in more calories than hunting does. It's a more stable supply of food, and that it provides a higher volume of food to the group. So typically, based upon these kind of resource procurement, women in hunter and gatherer societies typically had a much more equal role as men did in these societies as well. So some interesting things to think about as we move on here, that even though these societies were small and mobile, typically the people within them, and we can still, talk with some fair amount of assurance with these groups, because there are hunting and gathering groups which still exist in the world today. They're certainly not as numerous as they would have been in the time period we're talking about here, but they do still exist, and there's been plenty of research and studies done with them to try to figure out how our very first kind of ancestors survived in their world. And some of the things that we see are that typically people in hunting and gathering groups actually work less hours a week, typically around 20 to 24 hours, than people who live in these large sedentary agricultural societies, and that they're typically very, very happy. In certain cases, a lot happier than people who live in these large, much more complex societies. Complex might not be the right word, because even in a hunting gathering group, these people have to have an incredible amount of knowledge and information about their natural environments to be able to survive, typically just off of the land, in a way that I certainly could not. So complexity might not be the right word, but they do not engage with their natural environments as intensively or aggressively as large agricultural societies tend to do. And that's really where the big difference comes in. So that's question number 1. Oh, hey, maybe I should go into the actual PowerPoint to make it a little bit larger. That'd help, huh? There we go. Hey, isn't that nice? I'll try to keep doing that from now on. All right, question number 2. Looking at the above theories, what do you think is the most likely scenario of how the Americas were originally discovered and populated? Now, this is another very interesting question, and there's still a lot of debate going on within kind of the historical archaeological community about how exactly and when exactly this process took place. And one of the biggest problems, particularly trying to answer these questions from this long ago, is that there's really a relatively few amount of archaeological sites that we have in order to draw data. You can see listed on the little map here, there's about 5 main sites, and there's just a few more beyond that really we have to look at to try to piece in exactly when the Americas were first discovered, populated, and settled. And I'm going to kind of go through each of the various hypotheses here that I mentioned above and kind of explain its merits and some of its drawbacks, a lot of the points which you people mentioned within your responses to this question. The most traditional hypothesis has always been the land bridge hypothesis. That pretty much states that somewhere around 15,000 years ago, that in the response to the last ice age, that sea levels dropped because all the salt water and all the seawater is being sucked up from these large glaciers, and that pretty much created a land bridge between the western North America and Eastern Asia, between Russia and Alaska, essentially, if we're talking about modern day geography. And that over this land bridge, animals began to move from one location into the next location, and that the humans, the people who were pretty much hunting those animal groups, moved along and migrated with them into the Americas, and from there spread throughout North and South America. A couple things that support this hypothesis. It makes a lot of sense. We know that they were hunting and gathering groups that were following game, and that if game came across this land bridge, people wouldn't have even been, really realizing that they were going from one continent into another. They just would have been doing what they naturally do, following their prey, and trying to continue to survive. And that, only as time went on would they come to, spread and multiply and increase the population of the Americas. DNA evidence seems to support this hypothesis the closest, because the closest link that we can find between the current modern-day American Indians is populations within Eastern Asia. So the vast majority, it seems like, of these earliest peoples came from Eastern Asia, migrated into the Americas. But that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. Another very popular story is the coastal migration hypothesis. Now, one of the problems with the land bridge hypothesis is that the earliest sites aren't necessarily where you'd expect them to be. The land bridge hypothesis was kind of the only or the main way that the population occurred. You'd expect the earliest sites to be in Alaska and northern Canada on the west coast of the United States. If you can see just by looking at our map here, some of the very earliest sites are in the eastern side of the United States and in South America, places you absolutely would not expect them to be if you were talking about only a land bridge hypothesis. And one of the big questions that people have is if they suspect that around 15,000 years ago, people began using this land bridge, how in the world did they get down to Monteverde in the south of Chile, by 14,800 years ago? It just time-wise doesn't make sense. And one of the solutions to this problem that people have hypothesized is that perhaps they weren't just simply walking along land, but they were traveling much faster along the coastline by boats. In that case, they could be engaging and hunting wildlife along the shore, but they could also be surviving off of fish and aquatic resources as well. Some evidence in support of the coastal migration hypothesis. We do know that populations within East Asia were using boats at this point in time, and they were seafaring people, so it's entirely possible that some of those groups of people could have followed along the coastline, along kind of the Bering Straits land bridge, and just continued down the coast at a much faster rate than those who were traveling on land could have potentially gone through. Some things, however, that are still questionable about the coastal migration hypothesis is simply the fact that we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence to support it. A big problem with this is the fact that after the end of the last ice age, remember, sea levels dropped, and that's why the land bridge was exposed. After the ice age ended, sea levels rose again. So all the coastline at this point in time is about 100 miles underwater today, which means that any archaeological site that people along the coast would have been using is going to be really difficult and probably impossible in order to find. So unless one of these groups for some reason had a reason to haul a boat 100 miles inland, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that we're going to be able to easily find one of these sites. And if you notice, where a lot of these sites are located is very close to the ocean, very close to these aquatic resources, which is another reason why people point to the coastal migration hypothesis. Problem is, it's going to be very difficult to actually find archaeological evidence to directly support this, even if it kind of makes a lot of sense. Now, the Solutrean hypothesis is a lot more controversial, and there's generally the same problem with the coastal migration hypothesis. There's very little archaeological evidence, and the DNA evidence, remember, supports that the vast majority of people who populated the Americas came from East Asia. Now, it is possible that a small group from Europe were able to make it into the Americas very early on as well, and that they just later got absorbed or died off themselves, and so that their DNA does not show up nearly as much in the population. But that it's possible that a small group could have made their way over, similar to the coastal migration hypothesis, kind of traveling along the coastline of Greenland into northern Canada and then eventually into the east coast of the United States. Some of the evidence in support of this, there were very similar to Eastern Asia people within kind of southern France, the northern Spain area, called the Solutreans, who we do know were seafarers at this point in time. They were using aquatic resources, and that, once more, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they could have traveled along kind of this enhanced coastline region to find the eastern seaboard of the United States. Also, another piece of evidence that supports the Solutrean hypothesis is that the stone tools which became used particularly to hunt large game within the Americas, the megafauna, right? You're talking about like the woolly rhino, the woolly mammoth, the mastodon. Those tools are much more similar to what they were using in Europe at this point in time than what they were using in Asia. So some people have used that as an argument, saying that that could be an introduction of technology from Europe into the Americas. However, another possible hypothesis or solution to that similarity could just be that because both within Europe and within the Americas they were hunting these really large land mammals that eventually would become extinct, that they just developed very similar tools and technology to do that. It's not necessarily a direct link, but still a hypothesis that's interesting to consider. The last hypothesis I want to cover is not on this map here, but that's the Polynesian hypothesis. And that's the idea that potentially, similar to the coastal migration hypothesis, a group of people could have potentially made their way over through the Pacific island chains and into South America very early on as well. Same problem with the coastal migration hypothesis. Is just that we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence to support it, and it's more just a theory at this point in time. But that's kind of one of the really fun things when you think about history, particularly when you're talking about history from this time period, is that we could find a new archaeological site tomorrow that could completely change and alter our understanding of how this process occurred and when exactly it occurred. But right now, these are the best hypotheses we have. And once more, I said a lot of you came up with some really good reasons why you thought each one could have potentially been the best. But likely, there was likely a combination of multiple ways that the Americas were first discovered and then inhabited and colonized to the degree that they were. That it could have been certainly a combination of some people coming through the land bridge, some people coming along the coastal migration, perhaps a really small population from Europe didn't find their way in, so that, it's likely there was some sort of combination and there's not just one silver bullet to answer this particular question. All right, moving on to PowerPoint question number 3, looking at the geographical differences listed in the PowerPoint. Why do they have such a profound impact on the way civilizations developed around the world? And this is a really important question, particularly when you talk about, the presence of Europeans and the presence of American Indians when they first come into contact. Increasingly, what we're finding out when we look at world history is that these groups really were not as different as a lot of people seem to traditionally have thought they were. Particularly after the Europeans came into contact with the American Indians, they really wanted to think themselves very different than the American Indians, and that has kind of gotten transferred into our our history and the way that we oftentimes look at these two groups. But increasingly what we look at is that the differences that did exist between these two groups a lot of times can be traced back to a comparison in geography between the Americas and Eurasia, the combination of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, as well as into the Steppeland region and into Eastern and Southern Asia. That pretty much the groups within Eurasia and the civilizations within Eurasia just had some geographical conditions which made the establishment of large sedentary agricultural societies generally easier for them to complete, and it made more sense for their geographical position, whereas in Africa, as well as the Americas, continental Africa and the Americas, it seemed that they did not have these same benefits, these same geographical benefits, and that therefore they had a harder time forming these large complex societies. Not necessarily they had a harder time, but there was less of a reason for them to do it. I think is kind of a better way to put it. Looking at our little comparison here, the first thing to really kind of take a look at and keep in mind is the axes, generally how the continents are laid out. Whereas Eurasia is on an east-west axis, North and West, North America and Africa are on it should be a north-south axis, not a northwest axis, north-south axis. And if you think about why this is important, it really comes down to the fact that if you're going to be talking about growing similar crops, raising similar animals, engaging in similar lifestyles, it's easier to do that if the climate and the weather is really similar with a larger group of people, which occurs when you're looking at places like the Steppeland regions or southern Europe into the Middle East. There's large stretches in Eurasia that have a similar climate, in which case similar crops can grow easier than in the Americas. Within the Americas, you can just think about the difference between Minnesota and Florida and different crops that can grow in each place and the vastly different climate and weather that they're having in each location. I know it's quite a bit warmer down there than it is up here right now. And that's another reason why, it's easier to kind of have this kind of contact and easier for kind of these large populations to grow within Eurasia than it is in the Americas. Eurasia also has several large seas, rivers, grasslands, making transportation and travel easier, while Africa and the Americas is separated by more dense jungles, deserts, mountains, which make traveling a lot more difficult. Also then, if you look at just the natural resources, the natural crops growing in each of these locations had a very large impact too. You see in the description here, 12 crops account for about 80% of the modern world's cultivation, and all of these can be found in the Mediterranean, the Near East, or China, places which had pretty much the largest population centers in the ancient world. Within the Americas, there was really a lack of cereal grains, which limited other cultivatable plants and kind of made the creation of these large states more difficult. There certainly was maize, potatoes, and corn, which is used very effectively throughout both North and South America to support large populations. It's just that there was not as many of them. Certain locations, those crops wouldn't grow very well in, and it was just reliant on a much smaller number of grains and of resources and of crops than you saw within Eurasia. Same thing when you're talking about land animals. Only 5 large land animals are very well suited for domestication. All of them are found in Eurasia. Within the Americas, they only have the llama. It kind of is the only one real large domesticated animal. And if you think about the llama, it's pretty much geographically constrained to the mountainous regions in South America, which means that it was not able to be spread nearly as much as these other 5 large land animals within Eurasia, and the benefits of those were not able to be taken advantage of. And really, this kind of presence of large animals, domesticated animals, besides just the impact it has on food, abundance of food, transportation, and so forth, also leads to the presence of diseases, which at first glance seems like it's not such a great thing, as a larger percentage of diseases are transferred from animals to the people who are living in close proximity to them. But as we'll go on and discuss next class period, this ultimately has an incredibly important impact on world history. Because even though these people within Eurasia had been contracting diseases from their animals for thousands of years, they had also been building immunities to these diseases for thousands of years. And the diseases had also been evolving into more virulent forms, trying to get past these various immunities that people had been developing. Whereas in Africa and the Americas, there was a lot less of this process going on. So the peoples living within the Americas did not have the same immunities as the peoples living within Eurasia had. And once these two groups come into contact, that's going to have some pretty catastrophic consequences, which, like I said, we'll be talking about in much more detail next week. Really, the end point of all of this is that large stratified states were easier to be formed within Eurasia than in the Americas. That does not say that they did not happen. Looking in the examples coming up here, you see quite a few very large agricultural societies which did develop, but it's more an issue of the percentage and the number of prevalence of these within the Americas. Also, if you look in the Americas, the places that these large civilizations are created are typically in a relatively small geographic area. They do not extend far beyond Central America and the Andes regions of South America. So that the large civilizations which did develop were generally smaller in scale and much more limited in expanse than what we see happening in Eurasia, where large empires would regularly form, fall, be replaced by new states, new empires, and it's kind of a continual process. Now, it's important to note that traditionally this difference between the prevalence of large stratified agricultural states has been used to present an idea of one geographic location being more civilized than another, or being more advanced, more intelligent, and so forth. And if looking at this kind of geographical comparison, that really kind of throws that idea out the window, particularly when you're thinking about the vast kind of success that these groups and populations who did not survive off of large stratified states had within the Americas. in most cases, it simply would not make sense for these groups, which oftentimes, survived off of subsistence practices, combining hunting, gathering with some agriculture, as well as just kind of seasonal migratory patterns based upon what crops are being able to be grown where, what animals are going to be prevalent where, and that this is going to be the best way to support the most amount of people in those locations which are not well suited for large stratified states, because what good does it do you to have a population of 50,000 if you can't feed them? Right? Everyone's going to starve. So the degree to which the peoples within the Americas engaged with their environment, created cultures and religions, was just as advanced and just as, that's what I'm looking for, just as detailed as what you see occurring within Eurasia. So right off the bat, I'd like to try to get away from this idea of Eurasia kind of being the land of civilization and the Americas trying to be, or being perceived as, a land of being less civilized, because as we see, that's really not the case, and that the people who were choosing to live a certain way were doing that for a very good reason. And that's because it made the most sense for their geographic location and for their lifestyles. So moving on from there. Once more, this was not a good graphic. I'm just kind of showing you this comparison of the axes as well as the location of these various grains and important animals throughout the world, and where the vast concentration of those is. Moving on to question number 4. What similarities do you notice between these early civilizations of Central and South America? And I thought that all of you pretty much did a very great job of answering this question, bringing up the idea that they all had the prevalence of pyramids, the influence and impact that the Olmec civilization had, the presence of ball courts and the ball court game, large religious warrior cultures. The presence of sacrifice was present in a lot of these cultures. And really, you see a lot of these similarities, and that kind of gets back to the previous discussion we just had, the idea that so many of these large civilizations were being developed in a relatively small geographic area compared to Eurasia, and that there was generally fewer influences from outside civilizations of similar scale than as we see within Eurasia, meaning that even through a 1,000-year time period, the civilizations which are developing are, in a lot of cases, really similar to one another. And there seems to be a lot more homogeneity within the civilizations of the Americas than we see developing within Eurasia at this same time period. All right, going on to question number 5. What aspects do you believe led to the success of these American Indian populations in thousands of years before contact with Europeans? And once more, you guys all did a really good job describing how these American Indian groups were intensively engaging with their environments, creating lifeways and cultures which were incredibly advanced and adept to their environments, and created pretty much a situation where they're able to fulfill all the needs that human beings have in a very successful manner. And really just the success that American Indians had prior to the contact period, where it seemed like the population was somewhere between 40 to 200 million people living within the Americas, which is pretty astonishing. And that the fact that these American Indian groups were able to live from the very tip of the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the tip of South America and pretty much everywhere in between, and were able to adapt to the incredibly wide variety of environments present within the Americas, is also pretty incredible and should be taken into account. And once more, this is just trying to provide some pushback to this idea that American Indian groups were in some way, shape, or form less civilized or behind the Europeans before the Europeans arrived and before the contact period, and that for some reason American Indians were sitting around waiting for these European goods and things like that to help make their lifestyles. There certainly was a big change when the Europeans came into contact for the first time with American Indian groups, and there were some very big consequences that came along with that. But once more, a lot of those go back to that question number 2 we were looking at, these differences in the geography between the two locations, their presence with animals, immunity, resistances, and so forth, and that seems to really be the defining factor in the relationship between American Indians and Europeans, and we'll get much more into that going into next class period. But really, the idea that millions of people were surviving in an incredibly advanced and sophisticated way for thousands and thousands of years before contact with the Europeans is kind of the point of this PowerPoint, and hopefully what you've all been able to take away from it. All right, thanks very much for your time. Once more, I'll be posting one of these every week. Next week, we'll include the document exercise along with it as kind of a supplemental portion. And hopefully you find these incredibly interesting. If you have any questions about them, any more comments, anything you want to respond back to me to anything I've said, feel free to go ahead, email me, contact me, and let me know. All right, I hope you have a great week coming up here going into week number 2.